to welcome you today to the Drescher Humanities Forum Medieval and Early Modern Studies Colloquium Lecture. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Michael Dante of ASOR Cultural Heritage Initiatives, who's going to speak to us on ISIS and cultural cleansing, saving the ancient and medieval treasures of Syria and Iraq. It's an honor for UMBC to have such a distinguished Professor Dante. First, I'd like to make some other announcements. Wearing several. If you'd like to tweet during this event, please use the account at UMBC Humanities and hashtag, I was told to say these things, hashtag Humanities Forum. I also want to invite you to attend the next Humanities Forum event, Wednesday, March 15th at 4 p.m. right Condition, Islam and the Rise of the West. Anwar Mahid, Director of the Center for Global Humanities, Vice President for Global Affairs and Communications, and Professor of English at the University of New England. In this lecture, Professor Mahid extends the notion of Orientalism back to the late Middle Ages and discusses the ways a Western worldview and crusading spirit forced Muslims and other non-Western traditions into a defensive mode, which continues to affect our world order today. It would be a great talk and of interest to many of you here today. I encourage you to take a look at other events in the Humanities Forum series, either on the flyer we have available or at the Drescher Center website. For visitors from outside UMBC, please feel free to sign up for the Drescher Center Humanities Forum email list on the clipboard at the back of the room. I'd also like to make some general comments and make some general notes of thanks to Dean Scott Casper for his generous support of MEMS and our lecture series, the Drescher Humanities Forum, and the co-sponsoring Departments of Ancient Studies, Political Science, and Visual Arts. There are MEMS flyers at your seats. We encourage all students here today who are undergraduates to register for the minor as soon as possible. If you have any questions about our minor, please feel free to contact me after we'll have a reception at about 5:30. Please feel free to come see me or email me, visit the website, and we'd be happy to answer any of your questions. So without further ado, David, can you take it from here?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Michael Dante, to welcome him to the UMBC campus. Dr. Dante got his BA from Purdue in anthropology and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, likewise from the anthropology department, although he is an archaeologist. He is currently the academic director of ASOR, which is the American Schools of Oriental Research for Heritage Initiatives. And he also will be the NEH Associate Professor of the Humanities in the Department of Classics at Colgate University later this year. Dr. Dante is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. He was elected in May of 2011. And one criterion of election is to desire to promote the honor, business, and emoluments of society. It's a perfectly good 18th century word. The society got its charter in 1751, so just around the time of our Constitution. Dr. Dante has done archaeological research in Syria for over 20 years, in Iran, and also in Iraq and in the Kurdish part of Iraq. In recent years, however, and that's why Dr. Dante is visiting us today, he has used his 20 years of working and living in Syria to report on and to analyze ISIL's dual strategy of destroying the vestiges of Greco-Roman and Byzantine civilization in Syria, while also profiting from the illegal sale of portable cultural treasures. Dr. Dante is a regular in print, radio, and television media, and probably you've seen him, probably maybe don't recall having seen him on CNN or MSNBC. He has written in the Washington Post. He has written reports for the State Department and for Congress, in particular on the economic benefits that terrorist organizations have gained from cultural property crime. Dr. Dante is one of the foremost voices for the preservation of the pre-Islamic heritage of Syria and Iraq, and I want you to join me in giving him a hand as he presents his talk today, ISIS and Cultural Cleansing, Saving the Ancient and Medieval Treasures of Syria and Iraq.
Thank you very much, David. Move the mic down just a little bit. Everyone can hear me, I assume, now. This is not what I went to graduate school to do, obviously. I started off in anthropology because I was interested in the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia, and I first went to Syria in 1991, thinking that I was going to be an Egyptologist. I was a surveyor, and I was asked to work on the excavation of an ancient city in Syria as the surveyor. The city was founded in 3000 BC and was inhabited for 1,200 years, which is sort of small potatoes in Mesopotamia. But I really fell in love with Syria because the people were so kind. Living in the Syrian countryside without running water and electricity was a little rough for a couple of decades. It was an unusual experience, but I decided to stick with Syria. I really loved it there over the years, and I thought that that's where I would be spending my career. I worked in the city, just outside the city of Raqqa, between Raqqa and Aleppo, which is now the center of the Islamic State's territory, so-called Islamic State, or Daesh, in northern Syria. But I thought I would be spending my entire career there. I was investigating Middle Holocene climate change in the early Bronze Age. Will I ever do that again in my career if I stay in Mesopotamian archaeology the rest of my career? Will we have those kinds of research agenda in Near Eastern archaeology? In 2010, I can say that I noticed things were changing in Syria to a certain extent. People were more willing to talk about politics than they ever had been. We had all become accustomed to working under the Assad regime where one did not talk about politics publicly. But by about 2008, 2009, people were willing to have these types of conversations on our excavation or in the coffee houses in Aleppo. Our staff was Sunni, Shia, Druze, Armenian, Kurd on our excavation. It was a mix of the different, the cultural diversity that is or was Syria at the time. And we had a lot of lively debates about what was going on in the country, whether Bashar was going to be like his father or not. I'd worked for a long time under Hafez al-Assad, and we had high hopes at first that things were going to change, but they obviously did not. I was one of the first projects that pulled out of Syria when the protest movement was cracked down on and there was violence. I decided not to return to Syria in 2011 and received a letter from the Department of Antiquities in Damascus, as did many of my colleagues in Europe and elsewhere, pleading with us to come back to show support for the regime, but I simply could not do that. I was out of active field work for 2 years and then headed a State Department program to revitalize the College of Archaeology at Mosul University. Again, the northern part of Mesopotamia, an area that I was familiar with, and was very excited to be doing capacity building and rehabilitation work in an area that had really suffered. It's the number one college, it was the number one college of archaeology in northern Iraq. And I started a new excavation in Iraqi Kurdistan, a region that had not had an archaeology of its own. It actually had been suppressed for a century. The Kurds didn't have a history, essentially, in Iraq. So I thought that this would be an interesting place to work. And then in 2014, sorry, the two microphones don't like each other very much. In 2014, we were engaged in our work with Mosul University in the city of Erbil. Erbil is in the Iraqi Kurdistan portion of the country. And I was sitting at dinner with many professors from Mosul University when their phones erupted. And they received word that a group calling itself, I don't remember what they were calling themselves at the time, I mean, essentially to us, they were Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, had taken over large portions of the city of Mosul, and no one was surprised. They said, well, they've finally taken off their masks and they've come out of hiding. They had been shaking down people and extorting people for money for several years. in the city of Mosul, and they just eventually conquered the city. And then very quickly, we realized that we were in an active combat zone because they very rapidly expanded across northern Iraq to take more and more territory and then take a lot of territory in Syria. And we had to cancel the Mosul University archaeology program because the entire faculty had to live as refugees in cities like Dohuk and Sulaymaniyah and Kirkuk. They are currently running the university in the Iraqi Kurdistan portion of the country. So I thought, well, now what do? I continued my excavations in Iraqi Kurdistan when I received a phone call in 2014 to implement this program for the State Department to deal with the cultural heritage situation in Syria and Iraq, and at the time we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. I agreed to head up this program at a time when we were really focused on Syria and the actions of Al-Qaeda. But very quickly, in the first month of the project, the Islamic State unleashed a wave of cultural cleansing, the likes of which we have not seen since World War II. Just deliberately destroying cultural heritage sites and stealing everything they could lay their hands on to sell for terrorist financing. And we'll talk about that today specifically, but there is not a day that goes by over the last 30 months. I have a staff of about 50 people working on the project. A day has not gone by when we haven't seen something destroyed or stolen. It's a daily occurrence. Some days it's 5, 6, or 7 major incidents of destruction or theft. So I'll try to give you some sense at first here of the scale of all of this, but my main point is it's not the antiquities that we're worried about. It's the cultural cleansing that concerns us. It's the brutal manipulation of cultural identity that's going on in this part of the world right now. It's the erasure of cultural memory. It's the idea that you're either with us or you're against us and we're going to destroy your community. All vestiges of your identity are gone. That's what the Islamic State and some of these other groups are doing. But as you'll see, all of the major belligerents in the conflict are engaged in cultural property crime. The story frequently in the United States or in Europe is that the Islamic State is destroying this stuff. Everybody's stealing things, everybody's destroying stuff. It's just that Islamic State is the major perpetrator and they are engaged in these, essentially in genocide against many ethnic and religious groups in the region. So, it's a new type of program, just to get past the State Department part of it at the beginning. What the State Department did is they put out a grant proposal. And the American Schools of Oriental Research, or ASOR, which is the oldest professional school dedicated to the academic pursuit of Near Eastern archaeology, won this grant. That then brought the two organizations together to form the project that I direct. And it is, for lack of a better way of describing it, it's a Monuments Men and Women project. We're more like the book than the movie, if you're familiar with it. I like to think of myself as Clooney. And so what we do on a daily basis, we have 3 major branches in the project. So we're archaeologists and historians, art historians, lots of different specialties that are working to provide monitoring, reporting, and fact-finding to the U.S. State Department, the United Nations, UNESCO, all these other groups, governmental, intergovernmental groups. We produce weekly reports. They're redacted to remove sensitive information, but this information has been used by, it is my understanding it's been in a lot of important documents in this country. We promote global awareness. I do a lot of media appearances. We do a lot of lectures. But most importantly, we plan emergency and post-war responses. We're actually taking actions now to try to fix the damage, to try to recover the things that are being stolen, and to counter some of the radical ideology that's evolving out of this situation. And the way that we do this is we gather human source information. We don't have to try to do this. A lot of our colleagues on the project are Iraqis and Syrian archaeologists or other types of scholars. So we talk to the people that we've known for decades. We can pick up the phone and call people in Mosul and find out what's going on. Usually they're calling us to let us know what's happening because they want this information to get out. Their biggest fear is that the people in the outside world won't know what these groups are doing. So that part of the project has been like holding the ocean back with a broom in terms of the information that's flowing out to us. And these people risk their lives to get us this information, so we're very careful with it. We also have a team that scours the internet for things like Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra, or whatever they're calling themselves now, social media. These groups advertise the things that they're doing. They use it as propaganda. And so we have teams that look through their social media or collect other news stories coming out of the region on a daily basis, and we compare that with the human source information to try to verify or authenticate the accounts that we're getting. And then we have a team that works on satellite imagery. Archaeologists for several decades have used satellite imagery for their research, and archaeologists know the landscape. We know the landscapes of the Middle East intimately, and we're very good at identifying new features. So we do a lot of comparisons of satellite imagery, pre-conflict, conflict imagery, to look for archaeological looting or to verify the destructions of cultural sites like churches or mosques or shrines. A lot of that leaves an obvious signature. We look at airstrike damage. We look at where refugee communities have sprung up on archaeological sites. So these three sources of information, when they're combined, are very powerful for providing really accurate and timely information for policymakers, for people in the conflict zone who are trying to do something about all of this damage. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the situation in Iraq, compare it with the situation in Syria, and then give you some of the happier news about what the project's been doing in the conflict zone to address all of this destruction. The situation, so you have the Mediterranean over here on to your left, then you have Syria, Euphrates River snaking its way down to the Persian Gulf, and over where it says Mosul, that's the Tigris River. So Euphrates and Tigris, you have essentially there, between Raqqa and Mosul, that's the so-called Islamic State, but that's also Mesopotamia. Then you have the region of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan here, that's the Shamia, the area that's west of Mesopotamia, or Al Jazeera, the area between the two rivers. So in our first year, we documented 732 major heritage incidents. That's a minimum number of incidents, and it's unprecedented since the Second World War in 1 year to have this many major cultural heritage incidents. In many cases, the numbers don't do it justice. We're talking about the complete destruction of a cultural site. Not just it's damaged, it's gone. And in some cases, not only is it gone, but all vestiges of it have been bulldozed away and taken away in trucks, because in a lot of cases it's cultural cleansing. So that was staggering for us as we implemented the project. We had to really hit the ground running, as you can imagine. So the magnitude, frequency, and spatial extent of this, unfortunately, has steadily increased. I thought after the first year that this would abate, that this would start to slow down. Boy, was I wrong. The entry, particularly of Russia into the conflict, and the flow of arms coming in from all over the world, but especially Iran, has made this essentially the worst cultural heritage crisis since World War II. And I just want to kind of give you some idea of what we do with this information. I don't expect everyone to digest this, but the things we do we database all of this on a daily basis. We're keeping a running sort of tab on all of the destruction. We're trying to grab all of this information and archive it for future prosecutions, and to write histories of what's happened. And so you can see these are the different causes of cultural heritage damage in the conflict zone. And the worst is intentional destructions of heritage places. In terms of our typology, we've placed that under military activity, but this is Islamic State and other groups intentionally targeting and destroying a cultural site. Now, most groups in the conflict have been guilty of intentional destruction. You could say that the Assad regime has done this when they have helicopters hovering over a mosque and they kick a 55-gallon oil drum full of TNT out of it that smashes through the roof of the mosque during Friday prayers. That's a fairly intentional destruction of a mosque. You're not going to miss, and you know what you're dropping it on. But again, there's a little bit of latitude in this definition, but Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and some other groups, particularly Salafist groups, have been intentionally destroying sites that they believe are shirk or bidayah, things that are inappropriate to their belief system, their particular interpretation of Islam. The second major cause of destruction has been military explosives, where things are hit secondarily. It's an unfortunate circumstance, but it's been destroyed. Again, sometimes it's a little hard to distinguish between those, but if you look at number 3, it's illegal excavations of archaeological sites. So you have all of this damage from warfare and cultural cleansing, and then people, mostly just people out in the countryside living in towns and villages, are going out and they're looting the archaeological sites nearby. In every family, every village, every town, there's a story about somebody's great-grandfather, great-grandmother, who was digging an irrigation channel or working in a field somewhere, and they found a jar with coins in it, or they found some gold over somewhere. So there's a lot of digging out of desperation to try to feed the family by heating oil for the winter, these types of things. Criminal organizations like Islamic State have come in, and they are exploiting that. They pay these people a few dollars for antiquities that they then sell on for a lot more money. By the time something that goes for $5 in Syria makes its way to Switzerland and the United States, it's selling for $500 or $600. So essentially, Syrians and Iraqis are selling away their cultural heritage to support themselves. It's really predatory, and then the middlemen, organized crime and terrorist organizations, are making millions and millions of dollars. And this is proliferating the conflict. I'll show you some satellite imagery of this here in a bit. The idea is what we're trying to do is we're trying to crack down on all of these different types of destruction. Now, in terms of the types of sites that are being targeted, if you were to watch the news in 2014 and 15 particularly, you would have thought that all that Islamic State was doing was destroying ancient archaeological sites. If you were watching the news in England or, let's say, in New York, it seemed like Islamic State was targeting pre-Islamic heritage. We immediately tried to address this, and this is what I tried to do on live television and radio, is that in reality what we were seeing already from the very start of the conflict is that Islamic State and other groups were focused on more modern religious heritage. The parts of the heritage that is a part of living, vibrant communities, cemeteries, mosques, churches, shrines. And I'll show you some examples here, but it was only secondarily, or in a tertiary sense, that they would then destroy ancient sites like Palmyra or Apamea, things from the classical era or earlier, or medieval sites. They often did that to get the West's attention as a type of clickbait on the internet. They would post the videos and they'd post the pictures up, and they realized that it increased the number of hits on Islamic State social media, and that people in the West were outraged that someone had destroyed a classical era site. And of course, they could use that to their advantage as propaganda then in the Middle East. The people in the West don't care about you, they care about these ancient sites. And we believe these things are essentially, have to be destroyed because they're polytheistic and inappropriate. So we see a lot of targeting of archaeological sites and monuments, but you can see in our first year religious sites and monuments were heavily, heavily targeted. That only grew worse later on. Top 10 sources of damage in 2015 and 2016, just quickly now: explosives from military, intentional destructions of heritage sites, illegal excavation. It hasn't shifted too much, but look at how many incidents that we documented, over 350. It's actually 375 incidents of military explosives being used to damage or destroy heritage sites. What caused this? The entry of Russia into the conflict in October of 2015, period. Mosques, Sunni mosques in the north of Syria, just daily being hit in airstrikes, over and over, double tapping, triple tapping them in 15 or 20 minute time lags. Many of them from the medieval period, so they're obviously significant from a cultural heritage perspective. Oftentimes this is just flat out denied that this is happening, or the forces that are doing this claim that the mosques are being used by terrorists. In our most recent reporting year, 850 cultural heritage incidents, 3.4% increase, and you can see the distribution of some of these incidents on the map. The damage is concentrated in areas of northwestern Syria, and that is the area controlled by the Syrian opposition, who do not have helicopters or airplanes, and they are being hit in airstrikes by the Assad regime and by the Russians. So this part of Syria is just being leveled. Aleppo, Manbij, Mardin, Numan, that entire area. And it's rich in thousands and thousands of years of archaeological sites. Mosul, and then the area of the Syrian desert. There are quite a few incidents in Damascus, but they're fairly minor in terms of the magnitude. So this is a typical picture of a mosque after a series of these airstrikes and missile strikes, to give you some idea of the type of damage that we're talking about. This is a mosque that's from the early 20th century. It's not old, but it's a part of a community. Obviously, it's important to the people there. And a lot of these mosques that are more modern with rebar and cement sit on the locations of earlier mosques where there are medieval shrines and other substructures that are historically significant. The leading cause of damage in year 2 was military explosives, with a minimum of 361 incidents. And again, these sites are being hit over and over again. Most of the major belligerents in the conflict do not recognize that this is happening. And this, just to give you some idea, is this abating? We're almost done with the statistics, but what I want to do is to sort of show you the magnitude of what's happening on a quarterly basis. This is what's happened since September, November of 2015. It just has, the amount of damage has just gone up, and it's maintained these elevated levels. It's still there right now. We're still seeing these high levels of damage in the most recent reporting quarter. So what can we do about this? We'll discuss that here in a minute, but I want to show you some examples of these different types of damage. The second leading cause of damage, again, the numbers don't do it justice in terms of the magnitude, is intentional destructions of heritage places. In 2015-2016, there were 98 incidents of intentional destructions of heritage places. Most of them were perpetrated, again, by the Islamic State, or Daesh, or ISIL, as the State Department likes us to refer to them. And we call these performative deliberate destructions. This is a picture taken, it's a video still from an Islamic State video. The Islamic State goes to an ancient heritage site. In this case, this is the ancient site of Nineveh. It was an Assyrian capital city in the first millennium BC. Very famous, the site of Nineveh for all major religions in the region. It's a very important site. Very well preserved. It's a part of the modern city of Mosul. Islamic State occasionally goes out to the site. They take cameras, they set up, they give speeches as to why these ancient remains from 900 BC or so are inappropriate to their vision of Islam. And then on cue for the cameras, they either use explosives or heavy machinery, jackhammers, to destroy ancient sculptures, reconstructed monuments. It's usually a combination of reconstructed and ancient monuments. They film it, they then edit it, very slick. They put background music, they use slow-mo or repeat mode, and then they put these videos and stills up in their social media for at particular points in time. They don't release it suddenly into the internet. They wait to a particular date when it will have maximum impact, or they wait until they've suffered some kind of a political or military setback, and they use this as a kind of smoke screen to hide what's actually happening. It's a way to divert attention from a setback. And we have seen a lot of these, and this is the way we've coined the term performative deliberate destruction. These are very, very carefully planned out and choreographed. In terms of medieval heritage, Islamic heritage has suffered the most losses. This is for the city of Mosul. And what we often do to show you what's being lost is I'll show you before or after satellite imagery, or in this case, I'll show you the before and after photographs. Here we have a picture of a very important Shia shrine, the Mashhad, or shrine of Al-Imam Yahya ibn al-Qasim from the 13th century. It's a Shia shrine built by Badr al-Din Lulu, who was the Mamluk Sultan of Mosul. And this is one of hundreds of structures in the area of Mosul that is from the period of Islam that's been destroyed by the Islamic State. And again, they filmed it. They packed it full of explosives. It is a spectacular example of an octagonal domed structure, or muqarna, and they packed it full of explosives and blew it up. The people of Mosul, called Moslawis, tried to prevent this from happening, but Islamic State threatened to kill them all. In some cases, the people of Mosul have managed to save mosques and other cultural heritage in their city by forming human chains around it to prevent Islamic State from using bulldozers or heavy machinery. But it's a very dangerous thing to do, obviously. And so most of the major heritage sites of Mosul have been destroyed. Islamic State then comes in with earth movers. They remove the debris using in tandem trucks, and then they frequently sell the real estate underneath of it, the site. This is a total purge of these cultural sites from the landscape. Again, but what we wanted to emphasize, particularly in 2014 and 2015 for the media, was this is Islamic State's choice of heritage targets. Again, in the media, it seemed like what was being targeted was ancient or pre-Islamic cultural heritage sites, or maybe Christian sites. They were getting a lot of attention in Western media. But this was the first couple hundred deliberate destructions perpetrated by Islamic State, and you can see right here what Islamic State was focusing on. Oops, sorry. It was Shia heritage. Shia heritage throughout northern Iraq and Syria. And this is a way to try to foment additional violence. They're trying to foment cycles of retributory violence between Sunni and Shia to unravel a very unstable government and peace in Iraq right now, in the southern part of Iraq. They want to pit Kurds against Arabs, Shia against Sunni and Sufi, Turkey and Iran against Iraq and Syria. And a big six-sided chess match is the only way you can really describe the complexities of this conflict. But they want to foment this sort of retributory violence, so they frequently target Shia cultural heritage. In terms of Christian heritage, they take churches and monasteries and they repurpose them for their own use. They'll store weapons in churches, in tombs, or they'll use them for other Islamic State administrative purposes, thinking that if they use a historic church, the West is less likely to target it because they're using heritage as a shield. The same goes for mosques, obviously, and other types of religious heritage. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, they've been wrong. These sites have been targeted in airstrikes and drone strikes repeatedly. They've not been able to shelter in them. Well, this is sort of typical of the Islamic State then. ISIL's dual exploitive doctrine is how I described this in my talk to Congress. They pair the deliberate destruction or co-option of cultural assets, cultural sites, museums, mosques, churches, usually heritage places, to achieve ideological, tactical, and strategic objectives, and to gain media exposure with the acquisition and sale of cultural property for terrorist finance. For a while, the story was, okay, Islamic State is destroying cultural heritage sites and antiquities. They're destroying sculptures, they're destroying museum objects. They only do that occasionally for the cameras. If something's portable and they can sell it, they'll destroy a little bit for the cameras and the rest of it gets packed away and sold off to Turkey or Lebanon, period. Trust me. If it's not nailed down, they're stealing it. While there's this veneer of a religious organization, it's a very thin veneer. In reality, they're an international criminal organization that is engaged in trade-based money laundering, kidnap for ransom. The organization is essentially just a very violent international criminal organization. But the young fighters who travel to the region to fight for them perhaps believe the propaganda. This is a young fighter. I can't really talk about where he's from, but he's from Northern Europe. Went to Syria in 2014, and he began appearing in videos and pictures of videos that are essentially the intentional destructions or performative deliberate destructions of Sufi shrines in Syria. And he's in video after video of destroying these Sufi shrines. Sufism is a mystical sect of Sunni Islam, and they emphasize saints. And Islamic State absolutely believes that this is a form of heresy and they exhume these saints from their graves, they destroy these shrines, and they destroy the portable material culture. So this is sort of typical Islamic State social media. So what I've written, ISIL propaganda definitely promotes and legitimizes their doctrine among its followers and would-be recruits as a crucial step towards establishing a caliphate, and within its interpretation of Islamic law and ISIL's apocalyptic meta-narrative of the coming battle between East and West, followed by a 0 year. They want people, at least these young recruits, to believe that they're a historical force to be reckoned with. Nothing can stop them, and that they will trigger this apocalyptic battle in the town of Baalbek in northern Syria. Do ISIL's emirs believe this? No. There's a core group of about 600 or 700 ISIL fighters from all over the world that are certainly just gangsters. And then they bring these young guys in and they are disposable. Where do they get this idea? Well, a lot of these Islamic State fighters and Jabhat al-Nusra fighters, Jabhat al-Nusra is an al-Qaeda organization in Syria. They've got this idea of intentionally destroying heritage sites from, some of them spent time in Afghanistan, and they saw the media impact of the Taliban's destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhists back in 2001. This region of Afghanistan in 2001 was suffering from a severe famine. It had been going on for some time. And the Taliban had been threatening for a while to destroy these Buddhists, these colossal Buddha sculptures. And it got a lot of media attention in the West, suddenly, that the Taliban were thinking about destroying these sculptures. And in the West, organizations offered to pay the Taliban not to destroy these. And the Taliban said, wow, that's really interesting. You'll pay us not to destroy these things that we believe are probably, this is idolatry to us. We would prefer to wipe this out, but you won't provide food aid for the people suffering from this famine. And then in a very performative way for the cameras, they destroyed the sculptures. And it really got them attention for their cause. And I think that that's where this really got going. When we've seen the destructions of heritage time immemorial, right? The Romans and Carthage, this happens, but this sort of performative deliberate destructions and this propagandistic use of this in this part of the world really kind of goes back to this root destruction. When Islamic State first took northern Iraq, they essentially announced their presence in Mosul by targeting one of its most famous shrines, the shrine of Nebi Yunus, or the prophet Jonah. This is a shrine that is holy to Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Yazidis, the major religions of northern Iraq. Now, in terms of its historical significance, most of what you're looking at there, it was reconstructed during the time of the Saddam Hussein regime. Underneath of this, there had been a church in the Byzantine era. There had been a shrine here all the way back into the Middle Ages to the prophet Jonah. The reason it's on a hill is that this is part of the site of Nineveh. This is one of the two acropoli of the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh. So if you were to dig below that, you would find 9th, 8th century BC remains. There's actually, we now know, a palace underneath of this that dates to the time of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. We'll talk about why we know that here in a second. So Islamic State decided to target this structure, not because it's a mosque, it's a Sunni mosque, but because it has an above-ground tomb structure, and they believe in their ideology that that can become a site of intercession between a Muslim and Allah. And then that can lead people astray, and therefore above-ground tomb structures need to be destroyed so that they don't become these sites of an intercession. So they loaded it with explosives and destroyed it and cleared away all of the debris. And it had a major impact psychologically on the people of Mosul, and it really got everyone else's attention globally, obviously. They then destroyed sculptures from Nineveh, Nimrud, the Roman-era city of Hatra in northern Iraq, in the Mosul Museum for the cameras. Now, all the while they were doing these deliberate destructions of heritage in the Mosul Museum, they were taking most of the antiquities and selling them onto the antiquities market. And we were getting reports of that on our project from people in Mosul. They were telling us this was going on. So we were in a very awkward position because we knew that this had happened before Islamic State released the social media, and we knew they were also stealing things and sending them away for money. And what to do with that information at the time? We chose in this case to sit on the information. And we waited till Islamic State announced this and released their videos. And their videos showed destructions of colossal sculpture. This is a massive Assyrian sculpture at one of the gateways of Nineveh. The videos show the destruction of classical era temples and palaces at the desert city of Hatra. This is an important city that's associated with early Arab ethnicity in the north part of Iraq. It's just west of Mosul, out in the desert. And this just continued and continued. We made the decision in 2015 to try to counter Islamic State's use of this information by announcing the destructions before Islamic State could put their videos up online. And that's controversial because in a way, we're releasing stuff that could be construed as propaganda for the Islamic State. We're not obviously producing propaganda videos the way that they do, but we wanted to preempt their use of this information and provide the public with evidence before Islamic State could do it and information on what these heritage sites mean, accurate information on them, and to essentially try to diffuse the impact of this as much as possible. And the incident where we first did this was the Islamic State's destruction of the Assyrian capital city of Nimrud. Nimrud is located on the Tigris River in Iraq, and it has a very famous palace of the 9th century BC that was built by the Assyrians' first major ruler, Ashur-nasir-pal II. Ashur-nasir-pal set up an empire that stretched from Turkey to western Iran, down to the Persian Gulf, and eventually, under his successors, all the way to Egypt. So a major empire, a proud chapter in the history of Iraq. His palace was excavated by British, French, but then British archaeologists in the 1840s and 1850s. And these sculptures some of these sculptures were taken back to the British Museum in the 1850s and created a sensation in the West and really brought the archaeology of this part of the ancient Near East into the public's eye. And what you're seeing here are the bas reliefs or the wall sculptures flat slab sculptures that decorated Ashur-nasir-pal's palace. They record his conquest of Syria, southern Turkey, parts of Iran. They have cuneiform or wedge-shaped inscriptions on them, and then wonderful carved pictures, so sort of text and pictures. And there are hundreds and hundreds of meters lining the walls of the palace of Ashur-nasir-pal. It was spectacular. Many of these sculptures grace the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, lots and lots of little museums up in New England. What Islamic State did was they began by manually smashing up the sculptures and using little jackhammers and front loaders to smash them up. Now, we knew about this because we were getting high-resolution satellite imagery of the site, and we could see little piles of brand new, fresh white limestone appearing outside of the palace, and we could see the front loader, the heavy machinery tracks going into the palace, and we could see little changes, and taxi cabs were pulling up at the palace. And the site guard was calling us. There's a site guard. He was hiding in a neighboring village, an official site guard, who was saying they're destroying the sculptures in Nimrud. All right. Eventually, Islamic State fighters went into the palace and they gave speeches. Most of them had Saudi accents or Gulf accents in their Arabic, not Iraqi. They packed lots of barrels full of fertilizer, lined the walls of the palace, and then in the largest deliberate destruction we'd seen, and still is, they destroyed the entire palace. And it's just a phenomenal explosion. And released the video, but we were able to essentially let people know this was coming ahead of time. And they've just continued to do this. I mean, they are running out of targets. They're actually running out of targets. And at this point, they've turned, at first they were destroying ancient religious heritage. In the speeches that these fighters gave at Nimrud, they talked about how this was polytheism and it's inappropriate to Islam, and that the West had told the Iraqis, Western archaeologists had discovered this stuff, dug it up from the ground, and it was a corrupting influence, and it was a colonial conspiracy that Western people were telling Iraqis this was part of their heritage. And it shouldn't be a part of national identity. After they ran out of religious targets, they've just started targeting secular sites. These are the gates of the ancient city of Nineveh. Islamic State destroyed those. Again, in this case with bulldozers, but these have no religious significance. Again, they're running out of targets, and now what they seem to be doing in the last year or so, most of their destructions are just retributory violence. As they're losing territory, they have this scorched earth policy. Before they'll retreat, they'll just destroy whatever they can load with explosives or get a front loader out to as they move back. So Iraqis risked their lives driving by the site to take pictures of Islamic State's destruction of those gates and sent the photographs to us, and then we released this information in National Geographic before Islamic State posted their video to get the information out there, because it's important to the people of Mosul. When people risk their lives to provide this types of information, obviously you want the public globally to see it. Very brave. And then Islamic State eventually still released their social media. You can always tell it's theirs because the Daesh flag is up there on the upper right. And they publish information on these deliberate destructions in their Glossier magazine. They produce a magazine called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q, that's available online in multiple languages. It's usually mainly published in English, and it's used as a recruiting device. I do not recommend you look at it. It's horrific. And what they do is they intersperse human atrocities with destructions of heritage sites. They're still producing it. And they talk about exactly what their reasoning is for destroying cultural heritage. Erasing the legacy of a ruined nation is how they titled their expose of the destruction of sculptures in the Mosul Museum. They tell us they're erasing this inappropriate cultural memory. They tell us they're engaged in cultural cleansing. It doesn't require a lot of interpretation. And Secretary Kerry, I think it was last year or the year before, addressed a lot of this as genocide. Now, all the while they're doing this, they have a highly organized bureaucracy that, again, is stealing everything that's not nailed down and selling it. Refrigerators, cars, houses that they confiscate from refugees or people that they run out of Iraq and Syria, but also antiquities, private art collections, coin collections, jewelry, manuscripts, Bibles, Qurans, libraries, archives, the collections of Mosul University. It's all being sold. How do we know that? For a while, we would put these stories out that Islamic State was engaged in this type of cultural property crime for terrorist finance, and people said, no, that's not going on, especially people who are trying to defend the antiquities trade. They don't want the art market, people in the art market, to worry that maybe if they buy something from this part of the world, that it might have come from these organizations, or it might be supporting terrorism. But we knew it was happening because the Iraqis and Syrians were telling us, and because when we looked at satellite imagery of Syria and Iraq, whole archaeological sites were either disappearing or were looking like Swiss cheese. I'd never seen anything like it. There had always been archaeological looting in Syria and in Iraq to a lesser extent. The Syrians and the Iraqis did a good job protecting these sites when I worked there in the 1990s. But even at my own site, Tel Eswayhat on the Euphrates River, I would go home in the evening to have dinner, and at night, sometimes thieves would go out and try to loot tombs that we were excavating. And we'd come back and find cigarette packs, or in one case, a tomb collapsed in the night, and we found somebody's sneakers in the tomb. As we dug away the collapsed dirt, we were worried we were going to find a looter in there with the shoes. And they were pretty brazen about it. But once the Syrian civil war broke out, the looting just expanded exponentially, just everywhere. But Islamic State came in, and what they did was they provided new management structure, capacity building for crime. They go out, and what they did is they said, okay, all you people out in the countryside, you can't just loot these archaeological sites. You have to buy a permit from us to do it. And then you are going to pay us a percentage of the money you get for the antiquities, or pay us a percentage of the antiquities according to Islamic law, which is 20%. And we've got these permits, and U.S. Special Forces raided a particular Islamic State emir in the city of Deir ez-Zor in Syria back in 2015, called a man named Abu Sayyaf, and he was in charge of regional antiquities sales in this part of Syria. Also oil sales and natural gas sales. They view antiquities as a natural resource to be mined from the earth and sold to support the organization. They don't care if this stuff has human representations or animal representations on it. They're not going to destroy it for religious purposes. They're going to sell it to Turkey, to Lebanon. And who do you think's buying it? Not Syrians and Iraqis, I can tell you. Most of this stuff is cropping up, the low and middle tier stuff is popping up on do-it-yourself websites and Facebook pages. You can buy it, they put it in a DHL or a FedEx envelope, and they'll mail it to you. We know that because people are reporting it to us, and we're finding those websites. Some of the stuff's being confiscated in Syria and Lebanon. U.S. Special Forces made this recovery 700 antiquities in Abu Sayyaf's private collection. He had paperwork, accounts on the sales of these antiquities. He had a nice collection of his own stuff. And on his laptop, he had lots and lots of digital photographs of antiquities that he didn't possess. Some of those were given to our project to look at, and I already had pictures of those antiquities. They were for sale in Turkey. We were able to begin to connect the dots as to where these things were going. Some of it's really high-end stuff, some of it's junk. A lot of it's fake. A whole lot of it's fake. What they're doing is they're salting massive amounts of faked antiquities into this stream and selling it on, and making quite a bit of money. This is the ancient city, this is a satellite image of ancient Nineveh. You see a lot of modern houses on top of it. This is the city of Mosul in Iraq, sort of spreading out, but you see the city walls here. See if I can, I don't dare to, maybe I can, yeah. This is the city wall of ancient Nineveh that Islamic State destroyed the gates in I showed you earlier. This is the mound of Nebi Yunus where the shrine was that was destroyed. This is the mound of Kuyunjik. What we've most recently seen is that Islamic State has been tunneling. All these little colored circles, this is a close-up, are tunnels that Islamic State fighters have dug into the ancient mound. At first I thought this was for purely military purposes. Islamic State and other organizations have been tunneling into archaeological sites for defense. But what we found out recently, Nineveh, a few months back, was liberated. And these tunnels are massive, and many of them were clearly excavated for antiquities specifically. And underneath of Nebi Yunus, where Islamic State destroyed that mosque, they found a 7th century Assyrian palace. There are sculptures strewn everywhere. We have no idea how many antiquities they've taken just from that one tunnel. All right, and these are what these tunnels look like. Now this is really distressing because not only have they tunneled away all these archaeological deposits, scientific data, right? This is scientific data. It's the cultural heritage of Iraq. So that's a sad loss, obviously, to science and cultural heritage. but everything above this has been undermined. How are we going to deal with this in the, let's say, the post-conflict period? Are we going to fill these tunnels back in so that the sites don't collapse? It's going to destroy all that material up above it. And they've done this at site after site after site. So that's Iraq right now. We'll return to it, but if you have any questions, please just go ahead at any point, raise your hand. Syria, if anything, is the situation's worse because you have more belligerents, more fighting forces on the ground fighting each other. You have archaeological looting, and you have Islamic State doing these deliberate destructions. So it's got this horrific trifecta of destruction. And one of the best ways that I can sort of show this quickly is that this was the Aleppo that I knew, the city that I lived in. At the center, Aleppo is a large UNESCO World Heritage Site. And its old city was a medieval, there was a spectacularly preserved medieval walled city at the center of Aleppo. When you walk the streets of Aleppo, it was like walking the streets of a place in the 16th century in some ways. I mean, the architecture was spectacular. Some of it went back to the 14th, 15th century. Wooden arcades up above you and balconies, really narrow alleyways. And at the center of all this, you had this massive covered marketplace or souk where I would go to shop for our excavations to buy tents. I could go to the blacksmith and they would manufacture special archaeological picks on order on the anvil. There were people weaving ropes. You could buy carpets, kalims there, water pipes, gold jewelry. You name it, there was a shop for everything there. And it was just a spectacular experience to go and to visit this place. It's totally destroyed, burned down in a fire. Unfortunately, this part of Aleppo, at the very center of it, you have this citadel mound, a very, very high mound that's strategically important for controlling the old city. All around it is this old city. Right? The UNESCO World Heritage Site. What is this mound? It's an ancient archaeological mound, or tell in Arabic, T-E-L-L, tell, that has 6,000 or 7,000 years of archaeological deposits in it. And on top of it, in the medieval period, when the Crusaders in the 12th century, 11th, 12th century, when the Crusades started, the anti-Crusader forces of Syria built a fortress on top of it to fight back the Franks. And so what you're looking at here are the towers, the bastions, the wall, the massive gateway, and entry causeway of this anti-Crusader fortress. Spectacular, spectacularly well-preserved Islamic fortress, which has a mosque inside of it and many other important structures. The Germans excavated the site and managed in a very deep excavation to get down to like about the 8th or 9th century BC, and they had to stop digging because they were getting so deep. And again, what's happened here, in this area around the citadel, there's been intense fighting because the Syrian opposition controlled routes into the city that spiraled into the center and came up to the citadel to right here. Assad's forces controlled this side and spiraled sort of around the opposition's forces for 2 years. And they were in this stalemate. Not sure why that happened. I didn't do it. There we go. And they couldn't root each other out. It became a sniper's nest. Assad's forces used mortars and snipers up on the citadel to fight the opposition down here. Assad's forces would bring in helicopters and jets and destroy historic buildings throughout this area in really massive airstrikes. The opposition forces dug massive tunnels, hundreds of meters from their territory under historic buildings, and then packed the tunnels with fertilizer and explosives and then blow up whole city blocks to take out Syrian regime positions in this sort of medieval or World War I don't know how to describe it, warfare. And that's what the satellite images look like. These are the explosion epicenters of tunnel bombs. This one was a 15th century mosque and Islamic school, or madrasa. It's completely, not only is it completely gone, but several meters of what was under it have been thrown into the air and came raining down on all of the surrounding minarets and domes, just raining bricks and rocks onto them. While it looks like these buildings are intact in the surrounding area, most of them have been shaken so many times by bombs, tunnel bombs, airstrikes, or debris raining down on them. Most of them will probably have to be demolished. It's almost all gone. I don't recognize it. The satellite images are really distressing. But when I see this is just one impact of a mortar attack on the citadel to try to root out a regime sniper. That was a medieval wall of the citadel, completely collapsed. This is where that citadel is today, just to give you an idea of the damage. So there's the old city citadel. This is opposition territory before. This all belongs to the Syrian regime now. The Syrian opposition has been run out of Aleppo. But up until about 6 months ago, this was opposition territory. Each one of these little red and blue dots was a regime barrel bombing on the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Aleppo, to give you some idea of how many bombs are being dropped on this medieval city. And the cemeteries, deliberately targeted all the time. Cemeteries are our primary target. And this is what Aleppo looks like. I'm sorry, it's a little coarse-grained, but these are places I used to recognize. And when I look at these photographs now, I don't know what I'm looking at. I don't know these intersections, these parts of Aleppo. The city's gone. It reminds me of places like Bologna after World War II, after the Nazis were pushed out, or parts of Poland or France. The whole urban scape has just been flattened. What are we going to do with this? What will the international community do in the post-conflict period? How many billions of dollars for Aleppo alone? Who should go in and do this kind of work, and why? It's really troubling when we look at the city of Aleppo and what's happened. And that's just one city. Mosul, Raqqa, Hama, Homs, Palmyra. Let's talk about Palmyra. That's the Aleppo citadel today. I used to have coffee and tea here at a cafe. Christian sites. Syria, you may or may not know, Syria had some of the very best preserved early Christian churches and monasteries in the Middle East. It was a spectacular landscape. Actually, whole landscapes of early Christian landscapes preserved. This is what's called the Dead Cities region of Syria, if you're not familiar with it. Buildings that were preserved all the way up to their roof level from the Byzantine era and up to medieval times. This is what was left. I used to visit this particular site all the time. Love this site. Because when I was a kid, I was fascinated with the story of Saint Simon, or Simeon the Stylite, who sat on top of a column and would answer questions to pilgrims. They would come and visit him. This used to be a column, and there was a church built here in honor of Saint Simeon after he died. But pilgrims on the road, the pilgrim road to Jerusalem, would stop at the site and chip away at the column to take away little pieces of him. The column is a relic. So when I would visit the site in the 1990s, that was supposedly St. Simeon's column, as I remember it. And this wonderfully preserved early church. And there was a monastery there and many other buildings. This, unfortunately, this site was militarized. It was used as a military base by Jabhat al-Nusra, that al-Qaeda group I was mentioning, and it has been bombed repeatedly. And that's what St. Simeon's column looks like today. And that's what the site looks like. It's just been hit repeatedly by rockets and mortar fire. I can go on and on and on. But the Dead Cities region, which was just this spectacularly preserved landscape, has been pulverized. Not only has it been hit by all these airstrikes, it's been heavily militarized, but it's where refugees from Aleppo have moved to seek shelter. Since there are all these subterranean tombs in this region and these well-preserved buildings, rather than stay in Aleppo and be bombed by the regime or the Russians or whomever, they moved out into the countryside and they took shelter in heritage sites. They're tearing down the walls of these sites and grinding the limestone up to make cement and plaster for their houses, reusing them. So again, all these different processes that are coming together to destroy Syria's heritage. But no site in Syria has been hit quite so hard as Palmyra. And Palmyra really tells a story. I'm going to move through it quickly. But our project followed Palmyra from the start of the Islamic State occupation all the way up to today. Now, what is Palmyra? Palmyra, or Tadmor, as it's called, is a city out in the Syrian desert. So Syria, you've got the coastal zone, which is a lot like California. Beautiful place. Always wanted to have an excavation permit to work in that part. I worked out here in the middle of the desert, but I love to go to Palmyra. It's an oasis out in the city that essentially linked the Silk Route and the spice routes coming from China through Iran and Iraq to the Mediterranean and Rome in antiquity. And because of that trade, the silk, the spices, from the time of Alexander the Great, slightly after him, through the Roman era, up through the Roman era, Palmyra became fabulously wealthy. And it was a Syrian city. And it was a city that had many, many different religions, early Jewish community, pagan religions of the Middle East, classical pagan religions, all kind of coming together. It had many different ethnicities, Persian, Egyptian, Syrian, Arab, Nabatean. Many different languages were spoken there. It was a cultural fusion in the classical era. And it had an architecture that was, the architecture was incredibly well preserved. And it took all of these different ideas from Persia, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, and sort of fused them together. So the wealth, this sort of international character made it just incomparable place. It was where I usually would end up when I was teaching in Syria. I would teach groups archaeology and Syrian history. I would always take the students to Palmyra last. Go out there, try to get there early in the morning when the sun was coming up, and we would go to, near Palmyra, there's a medieval fortress that looks out across the Roman remains, and we would watch either sunset or sunrise, depending on my state of health. And that's what, the reason it was so well preserved is that it had just passed through so many different phases of history. Why I liked it so much too is that Palmyra was the epicenter of a rebellion against the Roman Empire. Its queen, Queen Zenobia, essentially cast off the yoke of Rome and led a rebellion against Rome that essentially, for a short period of time, she ruled the area from Egypt all the way up to Turkey. Now that Rome put down Zenobia's rebellion and this Palmyrene empire very quickly, but in a way, it's a really compelling period of Syrian history. And to Syrians, it's very important too. And one of them, actually Zenobia, or a reconstruction of what she might have looked like, was on Syrian paper currency. It's an important part of national identity. A commercial center, a multicultural center. Now, when Islamic State conquered the site, it had already suffered a lot of destruction because the site was militarized by the Syrian regime. Because Palmyra sits in the desert, it sits at the center of a number of different roads coming in from Iraq and other areas. And so it has a lot of military significance. It was also the location of quite possibly the Syrian regime's most infamous prison, where they put political prisoners that they wanted to disappear. So it had kind of a reputation as this sort of, and also it was a desert smuggling town. When I would go there, you could buy anything. When Islamic State came in, they essentially pushed the Syrian regime out and the Syrian opposition that had been trying to fight for the site for some time. Now, during that time, the regime had destroyed some things, the opposition had destroyed some things, and a lot of illegal excavation had taken place under the watchful eye of Syrian soldiers who were paid to just kind of turn a blind eye while people looted the site. But when Islamic State came in, things really went from bad to worse. But what did Islamic State focus on first? While they were still fighting the regime, as Islamic State fighters came in and they were still fighting, they were still under fire, rather than continue fighting, some of their fighters peeled off and began destroying cultural heritage sites. But they didn't focus on things from the pre-Islamic era. They focused on things that were significant to other sects of Islam. This shows you their motivation. It shows you their leadership's thinking clearer than anything else, I think. They immediately, deliberately destroyed a Sufi shrine while they were still fighting to secure the city, to produce a video. They blew up a Shia shrine out in the neighboring desert from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. It's actually a shrine to one of the Prophet's close relatives, Sheikh Mohammed bin Ali. Loaded it full of explosives and destroyed it, and filmed it, and photographed it. So far, Palmyra, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, hadn't suffered any damage. We were a little puzzled. They took people who had been convicted of minor crimes and forced them to destroy cemeteries in the town. These are the cemeteries that people are related to, because above-ground graves are inappropriate to Islam. So if you're caught smoking cigarettes, your beard's not long enough, you're wearing the wrong clothes, your veil's not proper, you can be sentenced to destroy 100 or 200 tombstones out there. And then they destroyed an important Christian monastery, the monastery of Mar Elian, or St. Julian, which dates back to the Middle Ages, where many, many patriarchs of the Christian church had been buried. Not only did they destroy the monastery, they exhumed all of the patriarchs from their graves and looted what was in those graves on camera. Yeah. There's one of the sarcophagi from the early period. Pretty graphic stuff. Lots of deliberate destructions, but this is cultural cleansing. Didn't touch the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And then we began to get reports from the people in Tadmor, who we could get on the cell phone, that Islamic State was putting explosives in the this is a satellite image, in the various standing monuments of Palmyra. There are temples, there are tower tombs, there are subterranean tomb complexes. There's just monuments everywhere out in the desert. What could we do? They went into Tadmor, and on bullhorns, they announced to the people of the city, there's a modern city there, that they were putting explosives in the monuments. They wanted the world to know. So people were calling us up and telling us this. I received a map of where the explosives were located. Talk about frustration. So, and then eventually, one by one, drip, 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 they began to destroy the monuments. They started with a tiny little temple, the temple of Baal Shaman. In the Semitic language of Palmyra, or Palmyrene, Baal Shaman is the Lord of Heaven, and it was a tiny little temple. I loved it because it had a tree growing inside of it. And it was just so picturesque, and it combined elements of Greco-Roman and Egyptian architecture. I can go on, blah, blah, blah. It's beautiful. It was aesthetically pleasing. I used to walk out to it all the time, totally annihilated it. Loaded it with several tons of fertilizer, blew it up, filmed it. Why'd they pick this one? I have no idea. The main temple at Palmyra was the temple to the god Bel. Bel in Semitic languages means the Lord. This temple had been turned into a church with the coming of Christianity, and then it had become a mosque. And so it was very well preserved. Islamic State put 60 tons of explosives in it and completely annihilated it. That's what it looks like now. And here is a clever way that people have been doing before and after photos to sort of impress upon you what's been lost before and after. Then they turned on the cemeteries. Palmyra is famous for its tower tombs. Lots and lots of these. When explorers first found these, Western explorers first entered these in the 18th century, they found mummies with Chinese silks on and jewelry. Oftentimes there are subterranean tombs as well, where whole families were buried in antiquity, many of them incredibly well preserved. And these structures in the subterranean tombs are filled with sculpture and sometimes inscriptions on who's buried there. These were targeted by Islamic State, and what they did, I'm not going to keep showing photographs of destroyed monuments, there's almost so much you can take, but they destroyed the most significant tower tombs. It was as if they went through a list of the tombs that had contributed to the site becoming a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they destroyed those. But while they were doing this, they were looting the site. They were digging all over the place, coming up with all sorts of sculpture and antiquities. They were renting out metal detectors to people to go look for coins and other objects. They spared the theater of Palmyra. Palmyra has a fairly well-preserved Roman theater. That's the main portico there. That's the scene, or the background of the theater. There's the stage, and this is where people sat on the lower level. But instead of destroying it, in their first occupation of the site, Islamic State occupied the site twice. They brought prisoners here and executed them in the theater, and then they left the theater. Islamic State was eventually driven out of Palmyra, but then they came back. And in the second occupation, they blew this up. Why? Probably for revenge. Because right after Islamic State was driven out of Palmyra the first time, what happened? There was a concert held by a Russian symphony orchestra, and there was a celebration that the city had been liberated. And people came back and they started to try to restore the site and the museum. Islamic State came back, killed those people, and blew up this and many other monuments. And I can go on, but probably some of the greatest tragedies we've seen, that they're also targeting cultural personnel. This is a man that I got to meet twice. This was essentially the father of modern Palmyrene archaeology, Khalid al-Assad, a very famous Syrian archaeologist, who refused to leave Tadmor when Islamic State came the first time. They arrested him, they held him for a while, and they let him go. But eventually they arrested him again, and they executed him really brutally, because he refused to leave and he tried to protect the site. And this has gone on with, I think, at last count, 14 or 15 Syrian archaeologists. And people that are working for my project have been killed in Mosul. This is one of the really hard parts of our job. We've lost a lot of colleagues and people that we've worked with for a long time. So what's happening? Again, it's an erasure of cultural memory, a manipulation of cultural identity, right? They're trying to rewrite history. what's going on here. Many different forces are contributing to this destruction. But right now, the top of the to-do list, in a sense, is to get non-state actors, violent non-state actors, like Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra, out of the equation. Why? Because they are the very antithesis of cultural heritage preservation and cultural property protection. They are deliberately targeting cultural assets for finance and to promote their ideology or for revenge. Thank you.
I'd like to open it to questions. I'm sure some of you have some questions for Dr. Dante, so please feel free.
In Lebanon during the 1980s, there was a civil war, very big civil war. Was the destruction of sites similar in any way to what's happening in Iraq and Syria?
Yeah, Beirut was the big example for our region. And most of a good chunk of historic Beirut was damaged during the war. But what really damaged Beirut was what happened after the war was over. So when the international community came in and they began to redevelop Beirut, it's like they let out all the stops for development, and large parts of the historic city of Old Beirut were destroyed for development. They hadn't been destroyed in the war, they were destroyed during the redevelopment of Beirut. A lot of archaeology was destroyed underneath of it too. So much so that today, in cultural preservation and cultural heritage lingo, we have a verb called Beirutization, where development, post-conflict development, can be almost worse than the destruction that occurs during a conflict. And this is not only the case, it's always controversial when you go in to try to redevelop a cultural site, even under the best of circumstances. If you ever get a chance and you're interested in this topic, go to Dresden. Dresden is a city that has gone through a lot of pains over the decades and what it should be, how it should rebuild the monuments that were destroyed during the firebombing of this city during World War II. And you can see so many different ideas in the architecture encoded during the Soviet era rebuilding of the city, the post-Soviet bloc reconstruction of it, and how they went about trying to rebuild the cathedrals and palaces of Dresden. I recently got to see it, and it was really interesting. What we're most worried about with Aleppo and Palmyra and a lot of these other sites is what's going to happen, in a way, after the conflict, when they unleash all the development dollars that have already been lined up to essentially go in and fix Aleppo and put in malls, hotels, tourist attractions. What do you think they're going to sweep a lot of these buildings aside? Or the argument will be made that they're too unstable to preserve and it would be quicker and easier for everybody if they just knock them down. So we're really worried about what's going to happen. You had your hand up, bro.
Many people in the Balkans compare, well, not just in the Balkans, but compare Aleppo and what's going on there to Srebrenica and what happened with the Bosnian genocide. So do you think the Bosnian genocide will be much of an influence on how to deal post this situation?
Yeah, some of the legal instruments that were developed for prosecuting crimes against heritage for Dubrovnik and some of the other, the Mostar Bridge, those cases were some of the first that were essentially prosecuted for the destruction of heritage sites successfully. More recently, the Mahdi case in the International Criminal Court. If you're familiar with Timbuktu and the Timbuktu manuscripts, one of the individuals that was involved in destroying shrines in Timbuktu and the manuscripts of Timbuktu was successfully prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. So there's legal precedent for prosecution. One of the issues that we're going to see with Syria and Iraq is jurisdiction. ICC isn't going to have jurisdiction, at least in Iraq's case. And I think what we're going to what I hope will happen is will be a special tribunal, and they will develop some new legal instruments for prosecution. The legal instruments that were developed for Dubrovnik and some of those destructions, the problem is cultural property crime. A lot of the laws that are developed treat the theft of a refrigerator or the theft of a car the same as the theft of an antiquity. Now, when you steal an antiquity, you're taking something that has symbolic value. It's part of someone's cultural identity. A refrigerator and a car, maybe you really like them, but not quite the same, obviously. So there needs to be this disambiguation legally in terms of the penalties between cultural property and other types of capital goods and other types of property. So it would be good if there was a special tribunal, but there is at least legal precedent for it. But the scale of all of this, I mean, is I think what's most daunting. What I think is going to happen, and what I hope will happen, is that they'll use the deliberate destructions of cultural heritage sites to show the thinking of ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra, what their leadership was up to, because it is a strong argument for genocide. It really shows their hand in what they're involved in sort of cultural cleansing and genocide. Cultural cleansing is not really a crime per se. Genocide, religious persecution, depending on the legal instruments you're using, those are crimes, and cultural heritage destructions really are demonstrable in that regard. And if you prosecute for these destructions, what's your evidence? Their own videos and photographs. They show themselves on camera. We've got their voices. And that means we don't have to bring in witnesses and who are at risk. The reprisal attacks against witnesses are always a major issue in these types of court cases. So fortunately, in a sad sense, I guess, but I mean, what Islamic State has done in these brazen acts is they provided us with hopefully all the evidence we need to essentially bring them to justice. I think you had your hand.
So, one of the things that archaeologists and people concerned with antiquities law learned in the 80s, especially in the 90s after the Hague Convention went into effect, was that you really need to target these mid-level brokers in the antiquities trade. The wealthy purchasers usually are several steps away from the criminal actor. The guy on the corner, in a matter of speaking, is just doing it under duress by and large. What programs are there to try to find those bottlenecks in the antiquities trade and shut them down so that there will be fewer things going into the market, less money flowing back to the actors, to the perpetrators of these crimes?
Right. There's been legislation in the United States to address this and to make clear the terrorist financing, and what's really going on. In Europe, there are some efforts to crack down on the Freeport system. If you were to ask me right now, where do you think the high-end antiquities are going, I would say to really wealthy middlemen who are buying up the material and are holding them in free ports where you have complete anonymity, and you can hold this cultural property, you can conduct private sales, right? There's no scrutiny, and you can hold that cultural property for a long time. How do we know that? Because there have been major busts involving free ports, and if you're interested in this, look at the Medici conspiracy, which is the most popularized account of a big art bust that involves free ports. I think a lot of the materials in the free port system, and if there's regulation of the free port system, then they can really crack down on this. Because what's happening is the cheaper stuff and the middle range stuff is being sold on the internet, and it's hard to fight that. But the high-end antiquities are just disappearing. We know that they're going out. They're usually going to Turkey, and then they're going into Bulgaria, and then they're smuggled overland into the Schengen free border system, right? And then they're moved from jurisdiction to jurisdiction throughout Europe to complicate prosecution down the road. Because if you want to unravel it and prosecute it, you've got Belgium and Holland and France involved in all these different laws. And that's what happens with most antiquities cases, is people just give up. So what do I think is what's going to happen? It's going to take one big case where someone gets prosecuted and they're found to actually have objects that come from Islamic State looting. And they will be tried and found guilty of terrorist financing, and that will probably send a shockwave through, and people will actually exercise their due diligence, and they'll check to see that those antiquities have a real legal provenance, and not a provenance that's said from an old European family, 1960, or they might as well just put pre-1970 on it, and it just turned up somewhere under somebody's bed in a box, and here they are for sale. I mean, most provenance in galleries and auctions is a joke. I mean, where do people think all these antiquities are actually coming from if they aren't appearing in documentation in a will or a divorce or in a photograph somewhere? Do people think that coins reproduce in drawers on their own for sale? I mean, but people will tell you, well, they must all, it's really, it can't all be looted, really? It can't be, no, right? The problem, of course, is that the looters are stealing things that are easy to launder. Islamic State is looking for coins. They're renting metal detectors to people to find coins, and they're selling coins because coins from the Hellenistic and Roman Byzantine era can be laundered as coming from the Mediterranean. And when you've got one coin, there are 600 others like it, meaning you've got something that's got plenty of others like it. It's not a unique work of art, and it has a fixed value. You can look it up online, and you know what you should get for it. You don't have to be a genius to sell them, and they're easy to smuggle. The most common way for smuggling coins is you mix them with other change, and you walk through the metal detector at the airport. I'm not telling you that, you shouldn't do that. But I mean, it's so hard to crack down. I go,
Really
you have
quick
fault.
question
Yeah.
for information's sake. You mentioned the Freeports, and you mentioned the Medici conspiracy, the book written about those brokers. Switzerland, the Freeports in Switzerland in particular, became notorious because of that. But Switzerland is not part of the Schengen zone, which you mentioned earlier.
Right.
Has the Swiss government been cooperative in this effort?
Yeah, we've actually met with them, and I've spoken with them twice, and they are concerned about this.
All right.
Yeah,
Are they
and-
taking action?
I think so. I think that because of recent events there in the art world, a couple of different times recently in the fine art world, there's more scrutiny there, but there are plenty of other free ports, and there are new proposed free ports for the United States. So the free port system is something that, it's also a very important part of the art world. So free ports serve a real function for the trade in art, but they're used for some pretty nefarious purposes as well. Yeah.
What do you believe should be done with recovered antiquities?
Oh, boy.
Like, you busted someone, you've got
That's a
the
good
coins,
question.
you can't send them back to Syria. What
Right.
happens to them then?
So I was at an event in Abu Dhabi a few months back where this was the topic, whether there should be safe havens for these orphaned antiquities that we know are from Syria and or Iraq. They're from Mesopotamia. What should we do with them? Or they're from the conflict zone. We need a place to keep them, but what do you do with them? Obviously we want to repatriate them. Where should that place be? And of course, nobody agrees on exactly where these things should be kept. Right now, it looks like it might be the Louvre, but it's controversial. And what happens with antiquities when there's safekeeping for things that have been stolen and made their way onto the art market, or what happened after World War II with all the fine art that was taken by the Nazis? It's all been given back, right? Look at the Holocaust Art Restitution Project on Facebook, or is it easy to give back art that was taken by the Nazis during the Holocaust? No. It's in a lot of major museums. It's known to have been taken by the Nazis. It's known which families it was taken from, and it's still on display. It's really hard to get the stuff back in repatriation and restitution cases. So the fear is that what we'll do is we'll say, well, it'll go off to museums for safekeeping and these safe havens, and they'll say, the time's not really right to give this stuff back. Let's do an exhibit, or, now we've counted this as assets and it's on our balance sheet. If we give it back, what will the board say? Or, who should we give it back to? The government of Syria and Iraq? No, we don't really like them right now. We don't think they're going to take good care of it. So we're going to just hold on to it like, I don't know, the Parthenon frieze, for example. There are so many examples of this. It oh boy. So what I'm really worried about, and then there's the idea of the encyclopedic museum, and shouldn't we just distribute all of this stuff all over the world to make it safe? Don't keep all of your eggs in one basket. Let's disperse Near Eastern art so that it's not all concentrated in one region. And why not Egyptian art too? And I'll follow that idea, the encyclopedic museum, when I begin to see things in the Smithsonian on display in, I don't know, pick a country. Yeah. Right? I mean, it kind of only seems to flow one direction, that mentality that we should distribute this stuff. But there needs to be a place that the objects can be conserved and kept in safekeeping. But I'm also really wary of this idea as well. There's no perfect solution. So there was a lot of discussion of this, and I think that the idea would be UNESCO and the Louvre in Paris. Sure.
Two of the Nimrod large reliefs are at the Walters Art Museum here in Baltimore.
Sure.
If anyone's interested in seeing them, and they're in very good condition.
Yeah, and so that could be taken as an argument for distributing the material, because some of the best now Assyrian reliefs that we have are the things that were removed in the 1840s and 50s. And so it's a very complicated issue. What some people, and the hot topic now is, shouldn't we do 3D scanning of all of this stuff? And when we do that, we can have virtual Palmyra. And people have done this with some of the monuments of Palmyra that have been destroyed. There was 3D scanning of these monuments, and they've made replicas of them. Now, I'm interested in what you all think about that. The Arch of Triumph from Palmyra has been on display in the US and in England, and you can go and see an exact replica of it. Should we be doing more of that? And what are the implications of that? I get asked this question a lot, and it really, really makes me queasy inside to think that that might be where everybody's mind's going, is that we'll do all this 3D scanning, and it doesn't matter, does it? It's still bad when these things get destroyed, but we can just stamp out another one on the 3D printer. It undermines the notion that this heritage has an intangible value. When I go to Palmyra and I touch a column or I go to the theater, I like to think that that's what Zenobia saw and touched when she was there. It was, you just, I don't know, it's a feeling. It's the symbolic value of it, the feeling that you have, it, that you know that it was there in ancient times, and it's also a part of everyone's identity there. Is it something that's cranked off of a 3D printer have that same idea? We could easily undermine that intangible value of cultural heritage.
I think you can go both ways with it, because I think that it's a useful concept, particularly because, like, for instance, here I am internally crying that I'll never get to see this stuff. But on the other hand, the concept of being able to mass produce anything makes it seem less valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know also that when I was in Israel, there were certain places where they had removed the actual piece of rock and replaced it with a replica. And it was amazing to see, but it just didn't have the same emotional impact.
Yeah. Yeah, it's when you go to see something in a museum, there's that one painting or that one sculpture, and it's not there, or they have a replica there. Is that okay? And are you disappointed? Sort of feeling I have. For me, in a way, I mean, the 3D scanning is great. There are drones now for archaeology. We've got all this technology, and it's going to be really helpful for putting back some of these monuments back together. I mean, the Temple of Bela is now the largest three-dimensional puzzle in archaeology. And shouldn't we put it all back together? This is another question for all of you to consider. Should it be reconstructed? If it's reconstructed, who should do it? When it's reconstructed, who will pay for it? And when it's reconstructed, should we put up signage there that essentially reminds the person there what happened during the Syrian war? And will the next government of Syria allow that? This is a part of its history too. And these are the sorts of things my mind is turning now, turning towards for post-conflict reconstruction. Very complicated issues. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that ISIL sometimes hides out in UNESCO sites, and that's sort of stop the bombs coming in. I'm just wondering, I don't know what an occupied site looks like, whether it is obvious it's been occupied, but have there been cases of them staging it and trying to get the site to be bombed for them, essentially?
Well, that's an interesting idea. Not that I'm aware of, but my mind hadn't actually turned to that before. Since it's always been, we usually have the follow-up evidence of what they've done. I do know of sites that they're using that nothing's happened at all. It's just suspiciously going on and on and on. But no, I mean, that's a very interesting concept in terms of what they would like to have happen. Is that, I mean, they are trying to have these sites targeted, obviously, in a lot of cases. So let's just put a lid on that idea, shall we?
Is there anything we can do to help or to raise more awareness of this subject?
I mean, usually what I say was, what can we do to help? And I have a whole nother talk that I could do about what we're doing to try to help. I encourage everyone to contribute somehow to the leading edge of humanitarian relief. And that's what our project is doing, is we're a part of a larger humanitarian relief effort. We don't compete with that. People need fresh water, food, education. Cultural heritage is a part of all of that, and it's an important part of it. But again, and contribute to the relief organization, of your choice. And I have some of my, my own that I really like. So that's, I mean, I'm doing what I can, and my colleagues are, because we're archaeologists, we're art historians. But when I donate or when I spend time, I try to do things on that end of it. But yes, I mean, when someone's really interested in it, we have internships, and we're doing a lot of things to try to crowdsource some of this work. One of the things that we've been doing in the University of California system, since we have so much satellite imagery to analyze, we've released some of that imagery to the U of C system, and in Near Eastern archaeology classes, they have the students, they're training the students to analyze satellite imagery, and they're entering their observations of cultural heritage damage into a big database to sort of sort through it for us as a first go. That's an example of it. And we do have internships and student volunteers that work on the project to scour the internet to find, especially if they have Arabic language skills, Kurdish, Turkish language skills, to look at the open source streams for us. And we've done a lot of student projects, and we've got some master's theses coming out. I would caution you, if it is very interesting work, but the psychological toll that it takes on you day after day as you parse through all of these atrocities, it's horrific. It's absolutely, it can be really hard on an individual to do that type of work. So, I mean, again, it's something to think about before before doing it. But yeah, there are a lot of things. And before I forget, I mean, we are doing a lot of things to try to address all of this damage. Our project has been involved in many different reconstruction projects, preservation projects at museums and sites in the conflict zone, but we don't often talk about it. Why don't we talk about the reconstruction work that we're doing? Targets. So there's all this good thing, all this good stuff that's going on, but all you hear about is the bad stuff. Why? We don't want to give them the targets, human targets or the heritage site targets. And I can point to examples where there have been heritage projects to fix things or reduce risk, and we think that those sites were deliberately targeted later because there was an effort to preserve them. So we don't talk about that very often. We've actually recovered antiquities. We've gotten people arrested for smuggling antiquities. We've revealed whole networks in the conflict zone. And again, I don't often talk about that because it's just a lot of redacted names and people with blurry faces. But I mean, if I were to do the talk on antiquities, the antiquities trade, it's absolutely staggering how much of that's going on actually on a daily basis. But again, the details, you can't really provide the details. Questions? Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Yeah, one more. Sure.
Hate to get political, but we certainly have heard that there are going to be big cuts at the State Department. Will that affect your program, do you think?
Yes, it already has. We were supposed to, I mean, there's a competitive grant that we applied for. I can't say that we were the awardee. We were supposed to have heard by January the 1st whether we were the awardee, and the money was supposed to be in place if we were, and no one's heard who got the grant, and our program is still running on other grant money and everything, but again, yeah, not so much. So I'm hoping that it will continue to be prioritized, and if it is, I think that it will be because of the counterterrorism dimension of it. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Great questions. Really appreciate it.